So once again, to everyone, welcome to this session of Gabelli Forward. I'm Falguni Sen, and I'm a professor of strategy at the Gabelli School and director of the Global Healthcare Innovation Management Center. I'm pleased to join my esteemed Gabelli School faculty alongside industry expert panelists in this new learning modality that the Gabelli School has put forward. I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce our panelists as well. With us today is Anthony Viceroy. He's the Chief Executive Officer of WestMed Medical Group, an award-winning multi-specialty outpatient organization in Westchester and Fairfield counties. And we also are very lucky to have with us Susan Fox, who is President and CEO of White Plains Hospital, and is recognized as one of Westchester County's most influential executives. Jeffrey Meckler is here with us as well, and he is currently the Chief Executive Officer and Vice Chairman of Intech Pharma Limited, and also currently on the Board of Directors of Retrofin. He has over 30 years of experience in the biopharmaceutical industry. Healthcare in the time of COVID-19 is our topic for today. The COVID-19 pandemic has been devastating, with a global count of over 10 million confirmed cases and over 500,000 confirmed deaths. And a recent US estimate, which includes people who may be asymptomatic and not yet formally identified as COVID-19, of at least 20 million of us infected and more deaths than we had in World War II. The world will never be the same again. And we are all likely to pivot, a favorite word these days, to new ways of working, of socializing, and yes, relationship building. Our supply chains are likely to be reconfigured. Even knowledge flows and innovative activities are likely to change. This pandemic has revealed vulnerabilities we did not know existed structurally, culturally, and yes, ideologically. There are a number of theories about why we were so unprepared. From forecasting errors with an inability to read signals, wrong priorities in resource allocation, too little flexibility in the systems, or too much complexity in the systems with too many global interdependencies, and not to forget a wishy-washy decision-making history that we have had with this. The end, it is argued, will happen only with a vaccine in place and proper therapeutic protocols and 60% of the global population having immunity. Until, of course, the next pandemic and a new virus. What can we learn from this pandemic thus far that will not only help us speed up our recovery, but also put in place better systems that can deal with future pandemics? The key question for us is, how do we create flexibility in a system so that units can achieve their goals of survival and growth, while there is slack built into the right places to deploy resources and move them where they are most required? Lost in all this discussion is the fact that the very units which are responsible for taking care of the pandemic are themselves struggling to survive. Primary care practices in the US are estimated to lose around $70,000 per full-time physician, with a national cost of around $15 billion. Hospitals are struggling to recover from closing down of revenue-generating activities, such as elective surgeries, and the increased cost of ICU care, and healthcare workers working at great risk to themselves without all the safety equipment easily available to them. The pharmaceutical industry has had to work with regulatory bodies to fast-track innovations while reallocating R&D resources and learning how to repurpose work from the past. Flexibility has been the name of the game. Flexibility is one of the most difficult of business challenges that we at the Gabelli School of Business have been trying to develop new theories and new practices on. On the one hand, it may require a lot of slack in our resources, which can be very expensive. On the other hand, it demands creative use of these resources and an ability to share and build relationships and partnerships. It requires us to develop common goals and priorities, to triage them in the same way and help each other out. Our panelists have done just that, and we want to learn from them how they did it. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and at the end, the participants will have a Q&A tab where they can ask us questions. I'm going to start with Anthony Viceroy, who represents outpatient and primary care. And I'm going to ask him the following question. Anthony, when did it hit you that this was going to be overwhelming? And what actions did you take?
So thank you, Falguni, for asking me to be here tonight. I would say that I remember it pretty vividly. It was Monday, February 17th, that we started to realize that this was not going to be something that was going to go away. It was going to be life-changing. We started to see in our organization a lot of reports first that were coming out of Asia in January, and then seeing what was going on in Europe, specifically in Italy, that we knew this was going to be serious. So we started our planning process in mid-February. We revamped it numerous times. And I would say by the middle of March, our fears were kind of recognized. It just seemed overnight that we went from not having any cases in New York to, having one particular patient in New Rochelle that caused, one patient caused 1,000 patients now becoming infected. And literally overnight, we were faced with a pandemic here in Westchester County. Immediately after that event happened, we saw our patient volume drop by 70%, again, overnight. And I think what made it hard is we were going through this, unlike other crises, you had a finite ending period. We really had no end sight in our sight. We had no idea when this pandemic was going to improve, or was this going to be the new normal. So it was a little insane for a while, to say the least. We did a few things that, looking back, I think, in hindsight, you can always do more. But I think that, we did do a few things that turned out to be right. First, we worked very closely with our state and local healthcare officials. They were scrambling probably as much, if not more so, than we were. Every day, the information we were receiving changed. It was constantly being updated. And so staying on top of what was current and informative was very challenging, especially as, our patients and our staff were looking to us to communicate what are the latest protocols and how we were handling the crisis. And when Albany and our local officials kept changing that information, it was very hard to keep up. But we did our best. We tried to over-communicate, and I would stress that, one of the most important things to do in a crisis is to over-communicate. So we did that constantly with both patients and our staff. We secured PP&E. I mean, there was a lot in the news around a lack of PP&E, especially in the hospitals. At one point, we had to shut down 2 of our clinics because we didn't have enough PP&E to be able to properly safeguard our patients and our staff. So trying to get PP&E was a bit of a challenge. We actually had to go offshore to secure that PP&E. We then went through, and we're still following this protocol of constantly sanitizing our clinics. And, doing it in plain sight of our patients in order to give them confidence that our facilities were clean and that you weren't going to come here and get COVID. We implemented a front lobby screening protocol, which was new for us. We kind of eliminated the front desk check-in, and we looked to mobilize our patients through, check-in apps, so that way they can stay safely in their automobiles until there was a need for them to come in. Even though our call center was screening patients via calls, what we experienced was that patients were not being truthful about what their symptoms were, or, was anyone exposed in their family. So we had to set up kind of robust front desk protocols to be able to properly, not only ask the questions, but also visually be able to see, whether the patients were telling us what was going on or not, taking their temperature, things like that, and then appropriately triaging them. We reduced our clinical hours just because of the social distancing measures. We couldn't have the normal crowding in our facilities. And just to give you a sense, we have about normally 35 to 40,000 patients a week that come through our facilities. So to dramatically reduce that was a bit of a challenge. We also took the right measures in our waiting rooms to make sure that we had the right social distancing protocols put in place too, to make sure that no one was sitting near anyone else. We quickly became masters of telehealth, and we expanded our virtual visit capabilities far beyond just the normal routine visits. We also tried to share any small wins that we possibly could, because we were being bombarded daily with just a whole host of bad news. So I think to keep everyone's spirits up, we tried to recognize any small wins where possible. And lastly, we worked very closely with our healthcare and health system partners like Susan, who's on this panel as well, and White Plains Hospital, because I think, we were all in this crisis together. And in a time of crisis, I think having sounding boards and understanding what are the better practices, especially as things were evolving so quickly, was very important.
Thank you very much, Anthony. So Susan, that's a perfect segue. When in the hospital, when did it first hit you? And what actions did you have to take?
Oh, just a few. So it was mentioned, and great intro, and Anthony, thank you for all of your comments. And at the end of the day, how everybody worked together puts us in a place in New York, which is really a model for the rest of the country. But it didn't start off that way, and it started off very lonely. And for us, we one of our doctors, we are a 300-bed hospital. We have about 4,000 employees. We have 1,200 physicians on medical staff, of which about a third of that is Anthony's group, and a third is employed, and a third is other physicians in the community. And one of those other physicians in the community happened to be in the same temple and at the train station with the patient one lawyer, and I wound up getting a call on, I think it was March 8th, that he was sick with COVID. And as Anthony said, we were hearing about COVID, but it wasn't here. It never can happen here. And all of a sudden, one of the doctors that is in a medical practice that's located right next door to the hospital, who's actually a cardiologist, comes into the hospital and reads different cardiology tests for patients, interacts with our nurses, sees patients in the hospital, was in the hospital. And so you start in a place where nobody knew anything, and we're only at this for 4 months. But in the beginning, and very quickly, I would say, and to the credit of the governor, we really did become one healthcare system across New York in a way that we were able to get this under control and meet the needs of the state. But as it started out, again, it felt very lonely with not a lot of information out there and a lot of unknowns and a lot of decision making that you needed to figure out without a lot of information. And there was no playbook for this. Nobody has gone through this before. And in the hospital, we have mechanisms for different crises. We have practice drills for active shooter. We've certainly been through practice for Ebola and things like that, but this was here and now. And we tried to put some of those things in place in terms of organizing for all of the complexities, and you used the word overwhelming, and it was overwhelming. And very quickly, that structure, which is probably used around the world to manage crises, putting a command center together, et cetera, having a lot of people around the table, very quickly we learned that didn't work because there was just so much coming at us so fast and furiously. And we put together a small command center of probably 7 of the senior people in the hospital. And we were in that room. If we weren't there physically, we were there mentally 24/7. And it really has been quite a ride where it felt like in those beginning days, every decision was really ethics class of, who gets PPE. And in the beginning, we didn't know how the virus was spread. And we had, known to ask the questions, have you been traveling to China? Or do you have a cough? And very quickly, people were coming into the emergency room without those symptoms that people thought were the symptoms that told us that they would be COVID positive. And we saw that it was really community born and anybody could have it. And it was so important to protect our staff. And that said, we didn't have enough PPE to protect our staff in the beginning, and we had to figure out how to make do. So we could go on and on, but when people ask me how I'm doing now, it's still a stressful time. We sit here where we feel that we're in a recovery state, yet we're all watching the TV and we're watching the map of the states all light up, and we're sitting here worried that people are coming from Florida, people are coming from North Carolina, and we're going to go through this again. And I think we're in a different place, but in the beginning, there's nothing like what we went through in the beginning, when we knew nothing, when we had no friends, when we didn't have other people going through this, where we weren't able to learn from each other and communicate. And so it did get very overwhelming very quickly. And it remains overwhelming for different reasons. And being flexible, being innovative, Anthony talked about telemedicine. We had been trying to get telemedicine off the ground for many years, and nothing like a good crisis to make something happen. And so a lot of innovation in the hospital, a lot of just get it done, and a lot of communication with our community, with our government, with our medical staff, with our partners in the community, that really helped us be successful and sit here in a way that we have learned a lot, and think that we're a little bit more prepared if this happens again.
My God, kudos to both of you. Hats off to you for navigating through this loneliness and this uncertainty and this lack of information. But let me move over to Jeffrey. Jeffrey, in some ways, I do understand that you're primarily with the biopharmaceutical industry, and you'll be talking to us more about the industry as a whole. But did kind of science let us down, and not being able to be there for us, to be able to give us better answers? When all this was going on and people were trying to navigate their paths, what was happening at the biopharmaceutical industry? When did they really realize they better get their acts together and do something about this?
Yeah, and first of all, when you hear Anthony and Susan and people who are front line, all I can do is say thank you for those people who are doing their jobs, because it really was a scary time. I think sometime in February was when scientists started really identifying that, well, wait a second, this is novel, this is something that's going to have a different impact. But I don't really think, at least the biopharma industry really woke up to, what this crisis was going to play out until early March. For me personally, I remember getting a phone call. One of the gentlemen I worked for actually did the development of remdesivir in Ebola. And he called me up and said, I'm sending you a box of cloth masks, and you and your family, if you go outside, you got to wear this. Let me tell you, I've been reading up on this, and here's what's going to happen. That's when it kind of clicked for me. And then in the following few weeks, to kind of see it kind of as this evolving crisis, that's when it really hit. But when I look back at the industry, in March is when you really saw the large biopharma companies and even the smaller companies really start to act. And to be honest, I think when you look at the development and the changes, and we can go into this later, it's actually been really impressive. To Susan's point, a crisis really gives you an opportunity to change the way you do things. And when you look across how we've been able to, I think we have over 2,400 clinical trials ongoing worldwide, more than a dozen vaccines in mid-stage development. And this is all since, that February, March timeframe. That's unprecedented. And I think science is, if you listen to science will work. I'm always reminded of the head of R&D at Pfizer, where I was. We would have meetings, and he used to always say, just remember, Jeff, biology wins. You can't beat biology. So I think we've learned a lot, and I think actually the science has been progressing at just an unprecedented rate to address this problem.
I'm sorry, I think it's quite amazing the speed with which new technologies and new innovations have actually come into being. We've never had a faster rate at which vaccines have at least been tested on the phase 1 trial. But I'm going to go back to Anthony. Anthony, you said something that struck me. You said something about a number of things that you found different, that you had to do differently, from the changing the front lobby to getting into telehealth. What was, if you can think of one thing that you did that was a big change and yet had the greatest impact, what would it be?
It's tough to narrow it down to one. I mean, there was probably, without exaggerating, 100. But if I had to say what was the one most important thing, it is to preserve cash. It may not seem logical, since this is a healthcare panel and we're talking about, the crisis and the pandemic and things that we were doing. But if you look at what was going on in March, as I stated in my opening comments, I mean, overnight, we lost 70% of our volume. And when you look at, what you thought was normal wasn't normal anymore, you're thinking, and as I said earlier, there was no end in sight of when things would improve. When would elective surgeries pick up? When would patients feel safe and confident to come visit your clinics? When would the governor of the state lift the stay-at-home orders? We had really no idea. So the single biggest thing that I had to really think about was, will I be here when the crisis is over? And, the best way was to preserve cash. So some of the things that, we took really fast action on was, in the end of February, I secured the maximum line of credit through my banks. Westmed, for those who don't know about Westmed, we have a track record of, having great financial stability. We carry little to no debt. So my ability to secure a massive line of credit was there. But I knew if I didn't, in the days to come, that those financial institutions would not have the ability to continue to lend money. I knew the world was going to change that quickly. So we jumped on that right away. I restructured debt and my vendor payments almost immediately. But rather than just not pay vendors, I had phone calls with all of them. Having deep relationships with people actually helped. Everyone would get paid, but it would be under a different timeline, a different schedule. But immediately, I just didn't want to lose that cash. In addition, we took advantage of what the government was offering in way of grants, CMS cash advance payments, prepayments. I'm still waiting for final details on the Treasury loan. I don't know if we need it or not, but we took advantage and we're very aware of all of what was available to us. And, at the end of the day, this was probably the most unprecedented thing in my 8 years here at WestMed was we actually furloughed staff. And when you think about healthcare, it's one of those industries that is recession proof. And this is what you've kind of grew up hearing about, but that wasn't necessarily the case. You didn't realize how important it was, your cash flow, until all of a sudden your business revenue was cut by 70% overnight. So for us, fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, there were many staff that took voluntary furlough because they were either afraid of the virus and not wanting to be around a clinic during the time of the outbreak, or they had childcare issues that prohibited them from actually coming to work. So we probably furloughed about 30% of our entire workforce back in March. So again, very early on, I think we took very decisive action. We did keep everyone on their benefits, especially during, COVID crisis. We didn't want them to be without benefits. But, it was important that we look to minimize our costs. Immediately, we took, executive and corporate pay cuts, and our physicians took significant pay cuts, especially in the month of April, where there was really very little volume coming in. Once May hit, things started to improve a little bit, and now, as we're coming to the end of June, things are, much better. Although we're still vigilant, our volume is probably back to 85% of our normal run rate. I've had to use none of the loans that we secured, and our cash flow is fine. But I would say that it was very important as you're going through the dark times to really make sure that you are preserving enough cash. And like I said, we were in the fortunate position, unlike many groups that actually went bankrupt. Not only did we not have to exercise any of the debt that I took on, we were able to stockpile a tremendous amount of cash to get us through that short period. And now that things are improving, we're gradually going back, but we're still very aware that if a second wave does hit, we have to manage our economics very tightly. And again, I think having that financial stability really did help us through a pandemic.
So that's very interesting that you mentioned that cash management is really what comes to mind right up front. In other words, it isn't as though there are new things to learn or new things to do. It's about keeping alive, keeping the organization alive so that people who need you can come and continue to use you, that you can have the infrastructure in place that will still be able to treat them and work with them. So that's very interesting, and we'll come back to that a bit later, if you don't mind, Anthony. I'd like to talk a bit about payers and how you worked with your insurance payers, both your private insurance as well as government, and what would you have liked to seen as being different. But that gives me a good kind of move to Susan, where you talked about how the governor took charge, and you talked about on the one hand, you talked about the fact that a command center really didn't work. The whole idea of creating an efficient command center, because there was so much uncertainty. You did do that, but that wasn't enough. At the same time, it seems to be that you also saw the value in all of New York becoming a one healthcare system. I think those were the words that you used. Is that what helped you get out of loneliness into feeling that you were part of a larger community? What is it that came to your mind as being the one major change that you had to do in order to keep going?
So I think sitting in the CEO's seat, we sort of have this 360 responsibility to be thinking of everything. So what services are we providing? How are we paying for them? You know, all the things that Anthony just went through was certainly in my mind, working on them, but top of mind was different than the ambulatory business. The inpatient business was the number of people that were coming through the ER, the number of people that were coming through the ER that had to be put on a ventilator immediately. And, you know, the number of sick people that, quite frankly, the hospital wasn't used to caring for, not only the virus that we didn't know a lot about, but just the numbers and the complexity of the patients. So, you know, one of the things that we got to very quickly that was a priority for us was access at our hospital to the right services, and access across New York to having the healthcare that we needed. And the governor talked a lot about the different projections of what we thought we needed in hospital beds and ICU beds across New York. And the projections were a little bit all over the place, but you know, the number that he focused on was 140,000 hospital beds. Yet in New York, we only had 55,000 hospital beds. So to create that capacity across the county, he challenged all of us to increase our capacity by 50%. So we have 250 med-surg beds, and we needed to go to 375 med-surg beds, which is, can't even think about how one would do that if you weren't faced with a crisis and patients coming in and you just do it. Certainly, we're a very regulated system. We would never be allowed to put that many beds here. And one of the things that the governor did is he relaxed a lot of those regulations so that our innovation could kick in and we could meet those needs. And ultimately, we didn't have a need for 140,000 beds, but by challenging the system, increasing to 50%, putting up field hospitals, we had the USN Comfort docked, we used the Javits Center, we put almost 100,000 beds in the system, of which we got darn close to needing every single one of them. The other major challenge in terms of access was in the number of beds, we needed a lot more ICU beds. We had 3,000 ICU beds. We needed 40,000 ICU beds. An ICU bed is very different than a med-surg bed. Forget the bed for a minute. Think about the staff, the trained staff that's needed to man that bed, the trained nurses, the trained doctors, the respiratory therapists. So we not only needed the beds, but we needed all of those staff, of which innovation again, we retrained a lot of our staff while we were waiting and while we were watching the numbers come up. The governor created a pool of individuals that volunteered to be here and go where they were needed. And so what we needed locally was enabled by the governor's vision of creating one healthcare system, charging us all to work together. White Plains is part of Montefiore Health System. Montefiore Health System has over 11 hospitals. We all work together, and we actually were on the phone every single day where one hospital might have gotten overwhelmed that day and transferred patients to another hospital. And over time, actually, New York State was doing that. I would get a call on a Saturday night that another hospital in the county needed to transfer patients. Lawrence Hospital needed to transfer patients to us, and we took them. We got a call from Jamaica Hospital, and this was all orchestrated by the Department of Health. So the thing that we really were faced with as the number one issue that we needed to deal with was caring for the patients. And, you know, that is something for the history books and was an incredible feat. And again, by everybody working together, creating that one health system, we were able to meet those needs to the point where we were able to meet the peak. And obviously, we've been coming down ever since.
Thank you, Susan, so much. I mean, I just wonder about how that logistics gets managed. I mean, we didn't have this centralized data management systems that coordinated occupancy rates in the different hospitals that are now part of this One Health system. And yet you're telling me that somehow or the other, we managed through phone calls and stuff rather than really sophisticated data systems to move people from where they were overcrowded to places where they might have had beds. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, but maybe I move on to Jeffrey and say, Jeffrey, well, all of this is going on and doctors in these hospitals really kind of don't know what's happening down the road in terms of the science of it. Moderna is coming up and saying we may have a vaccine ready. And we have Gilead saying that, you know, remdesivir that kind of worked for Ebola might actually be effective here. And we have a very slow process, a regulatory process, which is the gold standard of the world in terms of how through clinical trials, drugs get approved and therapies get approved for the marketplace. And yet you need speed. What is the biopharmaceutical industry doing when they have stuff kind of in the pipeline, but they're really not sure? There's anecdotal stuff going on. What are you guys really struggling with?
Well, I think there's a couple things in the heat of the battle in April. You know, the whole concept of the pause was really to allow folks to learn what current therapies. You know, if you look at remdesivir, you look at IL-6 antibodies, you look at the tools, whether the steroids and the data that's come out. This is all repurposing of drugs that have gone through that development process. We know the safety profile. We know a lot about those drugs, and we're trying to see how they could be helpful in this situation. These are not new drugs that were suddenly developed within the last couple months. The drug development process takes years. And, you know, if you look at it, I think the average, you know, cost is, you know, pick whatever number, 1, 2, 3 billion, there are different studies. But what you saw happen, I think, in the biopharma industry was really a modernization of the regulatory science. And where I go with that is I think there were kind of 3 parts that you can kind of look at. The first was the FDA. Janet Woodcock, who up until recently, and now she's, I'm not sure if it's loaned or transferred or whatever, but Janet for the last, I don't know, 10, 11 years has run the CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which is what approves drugs. She, in the course of turning everything over, the FDA was turning around requests to do clinical studies and protocol designs, all of that. There were cases where they were done in less than 24 hours. Now, this is usually a process that takes weeks and months. I think the FDA did an amazing job, and it was through things. They had the coronavirus treatment acceleration program, and they moved resources out of other areas of the FDA to focus on how do we address this problem, what information, because, you know, ultimately the FDA is there for safety and efficacy and has a very, as you said, it's the gold standard of the world. Now, additionally to that, I think you saw collaboration and embracing of technologies, whether it was the telemedicine or wearable devices or electronic records, but it was pulling together information in ways that, you know, traditionally we haven't been as aggressive about, and some of that's a regulatory component and, you know, managing how we do that, and then some of it is just the acceptance, and in a crisis, you know, going full tilt into new technologies. And then finally, I think with the FDA, we saw an embracing of what's called master protocol trials. And it's a trial design that we've seen used in some oncology work, but essentially it's a way that you can have clinical trials with multiple sub-studies and arms where you have your single infrastructure that allows multiple things simultaneously to be evaluated. Doing all this as quick as possible from a regulatory environment makes a huge difference in the fact that we have so many things. Now, in addition, you have the what is called the Corona database, which is a series of institutions and universities and academics and researchers looking at all the available data. And I think there's been 150 some compounds identified through that, where, in a hospital, early on, people were trying, when they saw the cytokine storm, they say, okay, what can downregulate the immune system? Putting those kinds of things out there and then seeing what worked, what didn't, and sharing that across a broad community. This is really a new area for how we're going to develop drugs. And I think it'll change long-term how we look at developing drugs in not only pandemics, but just longer term. So back to your original question, Falguni, which was, how do we see this change and how did the biopharma industry adapt to it? That's really a big push. And there's an interesting point that's very different in biopharma than other industries. And I think Anthony pointed it out. When you look at most biopharma companies, they're very cash intensive. And as such, the way they develop, most companies you look at, they have very large cash reserves, because to develop a drug, the years it takes and the expenses. So in diving into this, the biopharma industry was not cash constrained as some service providers, because the ability to immediately address it and the cash available and thrown at the market was such that you didn't see any cash constraints in identifying new opportunities and trying to develop these drugs. So it's a very different business challenge, but it was one that was taking a look at the hierarchy, taking a look at the processes that were rigid and somewhat systematic, and trying to break them down where you could to really speed it up.
So thank you. So it looks like we all kind of sort of came through. And looks like we came through willy-nilly in some way or the other to kind of deal with this crisis. And some of our practices have changed probably changed forever, like telehealth and various other things. But I was wondering, have things changed and have we really learned enough? Susan said that we will do better in the second phase if it happens. Will we really? I want to open this up and not necessarily direct who wants to speak. If you just want to talk about, there has been so much about how we anticipated too much. New York was like crybabies, saying they wanted more ventilators, they wanted more beds, they didn't end up needing everything. This is a lot of the people from other parts and other states, and yet look what's happening right now. We are still sustaining how well we have done. I mean, I keep my fingers crossed that it stays that way, but we have done well. So are we really ready for a second wave if it happens in October or November? And let's hope it doesn't. And can we give advice to people out in Texas and Arizona and other places to what they could learn from us? I'm just going to open this up. Anybody who wants to get started.
So are we ready? So everything is relative. So we are better prepared than we were in March to go through this. But as we sit here, could we do better? And it is a bit mind-boggling to understand why across the United States, it was not looked at as a case study, real facts, people that died, shortages of ventilators, and on, staff that died. And then our recovery, which was staying at home, closing businesses, going through all this, it in some ways, again, it didn't feel, it was fast, but nothing was fast enough based on what we were going through. And that said, how the rest of the United States cannot see that, and we're sitting here watching that right now, is disturbing. And I'm disturbed for the country in terms of, you know, lives that are going to be lost for no good reason when we can share these best practices. We have these experiences, we have these facts. But I'm also scared because we went through it and we don't deserve it back here in New York. Everybody, you know, pretty much did what they needed to do. And we're now sitting here bracing for that next wave because a lot of people go to North Carolina and to Florida in the summer, and people are coming back, and we're already seeing examples where our numbers are going up. And so we're better prepared because we know what to expect, but we don't deserve it. We don't want it. Our staff are exhausted, and you know, there's so many subjects to talk about in terms of how this really impacted our staff that just saw an incredible amount of death. And so whether it's our economy, the staff, resources, our finances, as Anthony said, you know, we're all in recovery plan right now. To go backwards would be devastating. So yes, we're better, but we're, you know, not wanting to go into this again. And for sure, we can always do better, learning from our own mistakes in New York, but look at the rest of the country. And so very, very, very uncomfortable right now as we sit in these seats.
Yeah, I would agree with what Susan said. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever ready for a pandemic, even if you go through it once. The reality is that, you know, we don't know what a second wave of this would look like. So although I think I could say comfortably speaking for myself and Susan and Jeffrey and everyone else, you know, the protocols that we've put in place just a few short weeks ago were probably still largely relevant. The reality is, you know, what you can't control is what keeps you up at night. And I think that that's Susan's point, right? So in many ways, I think that for what we're experiencing here at WestMed is, you know, not only, you know, what will a second round of this look like as far as will the virus mutate, you know, how contagious will this be? I mean, if you look at the Spanish flu, the second wave was much worse than the first wave. The CDC has said that they expect this fall to be nothing like we've ever seen. Now, is that going to change? Time will tell. It may be better than that. It may be worse than that. Truth is, we don't know. So certainly we have to keep preparing. But, you know, I think that one point that Susan made that I would just echo is the mental well-being hasn't really been fully explored yet. And I think that just coming out of this first round, and we're still not out of it completely, the numbers have improved. The number of deaths, the number of new cases in New York are, you know, at all-time lows. So that gives you a false sense of confidence. But I don't think by any means has the virus gone away. It's just been a little bit more contained. And, you know, we're starting to see now that some of our staff really have had tremendous mental issues and personal tragic losses because of this virus. And what's going to be the longer term impact on that, we really don't know. And if a second wave turns out to be worse than the first wave, what's that going to do for the remaining staff and also patients? We've seen a lot of delayed patient care because patients were afraid of coming out, which now has led to, you know, higher risk of strokes, higher, you know, missed screenings for cancer maybe that could have been prevented had they come in 3-4 months ago. We could have started treatment much earlier. What's the ramifications of not being screened and preventative care being administered when it should have been, right? So all of this is going to be a longer term conversation and longer term playing out. But I think the second part of your question, Faluni, was, you know, what would you share with others? I mean, outside of the protocols, I think some other areas that, you know, I would recommend is you can't panic. You know, Susan talked about being in a dark place. I think I was in a dark place too. I mean, it's tough to get up for 6 o'clock in the morning phone calls every day when you don't know what the day is going to look like, other than it's going to be very tough. But within your organization, everyone's looking at you. And so, you know, you may not have all the answers, but you can't panic. And I think leadership is more critical than ever. I also have come to appreciate that, you know, hope is not a strategy. And so you really may not get it right the first time or even the 10th time, but being agile and flexible and working through each day, you will get better. And keep your network and your communication lines open, because there will be better practices that everyone can teach and learn, you know, from one another. You know, so I think these are all things that are really important as you're going through this. You can't go through it by yourself. It's
Right.
important that you have cooperation and collaboration, because everyone's kind of in this crisis together.
Thanks so much, Anthony. We have very few minutes. Jeffrey, would you like to just add a few thoughts on the second wave and preparedness, and what do we tell others?
Well, I just would echo what Susan and Anthony had said. You know, one of the things that was interesting to me is our R&D at Intech is in Israel. And they took a very different tack, but it was a cultural thing. When the lockdown occurred there, it wasn't, you know, because the culture there is such that, you know, they're prepared, everybody actually is prepared for some sort of lockdown for other geopolitical reasons, not pandemic. And I think it's maintaining a healthy emotional quotient through all of this and communicating, as Anthony had, you know, you over communicate. I do think that in the second wave, our biggest issue is going to be really in the public's eye. You know, as healthcare professionals, we understand a lot more than the average person, and they need to understand a little bit more to understand how to modify behaviors to best cope with the overall situation.
Lots more learning ahead for us. We are struggling at Fordham with opening in fall and addressing all kinds of very complicated questions. I mean, thank you to our panelists, but I know that there are questions out there. So I'd really like us to begin our Q&A module, if you may, and see if we can have time to squeeze a few questions in. I can see that there are some questions here already, and let me start with one. One of the questions says, what sort of efforts have clinical labs been implementing to increase their COVID-19 testing capabilities? So the whole shortage of testing and the imperfect nature of testing that has happened, what has happened with testing? Where are we now? What kinds of innovations have taken place?
I mean, I'll start. I mean, you know, early on, there really was no innovation. Being an outpatient facility, the testing needed to go to the hospital. So, you know, organizations like Susan's was where the testing was being done. We couldn't even get the tests probably for the first 4 to 6 weeks. You know, I'm really kind of looking at, you know, early March time horizon where the tests were just not available. So, and then slowly we started to get some tests coming in. Where we've probably have spent more time now isn't so much just in the testing of COVID, but it's also in the antibody testing. So that's where we've seen now an influx. The problem with all of these testings, though, is, you know, the amount of either false negatives or false positives, depending on the test. You know, nothing is 100% perfect. So even though our labs are at full capacity doing all of the testing, you know, there's still some credibility issue to some of these tests. I mean, we're still waiting for, you know, an accurate rapid test that we would be able to deliver. And, you know, we were under the assumption that Abbott's rapid test was going to be, you know, state of the art. And unfortunately, with a almost 50%, you know, false negative rate, we just couldn't with good conscience, give this to our patients and tell them that, you don't have it or you have it, and send them on their way. So I do think everything has been, kind of rushed along, and, we have to understand that. But I think as more accurate testing becomes available, you're going to see, much more lab and just greater innovations that will occur.
That's very, very interesting. And the testing is really, there is also things being done on the sampling side, the pooled testing that is coming out to try and mitigate risks that are there. So not only in the technology side, but also in the implementation side. And there are all kinds of innovations that hopefully will come about. One of the questions is a very interesting one. And Anthony, you referred to some of it in terms of people not coming for their regular checkups and what it might mean. Also, there are these whole stories around microclots, that we do not know exactly what kind of organs are going to be actually affected, that we cannot anticipate. Then there's this whole thing about, PTSD, ICU-generated PTSD that has been talked about, and mental health and other kinds of issues. Going forward, how has healthcare changed? Has it changed at all? That's the question. Is the delivery of healthcare likely to make some major transformations going down the future because of what we've learned? Anybody wants to take a crack at that? Both from the medicine side to the actual delivery side.
I'm happy to begin, and I'm sure, Susan and Jeffrey can add to it. I think healthcare transformation has already occurred. I think it's going to move even quicker. I think, what we saw, just something as basic as telehealth, which was, for most organizations, very low volume in way of telehealth visits, to all of a sudden overnight ramping up. You're going to see that patient preferences are going to change. And if there's not an effective treatment or a vaccine anytime in the near future, I think a second wave of this, patients will, ebb and flow as far as whether they feel comfortable coming back, whether the governor is allowed to put stay-at-home orders back into effect or not because of the economy. So there's a lot more of those types of questions, but I do think that you're going to see much more transformation. I think also you're going to see that, we had a shortage of physicians before any talk of a pandemic, especially in primary care. And now what we're starting to see is, because of this pandemic, in my organization in particular, we've had a whole host of physicians retire, or those who decided to, retire early because they had underlying conditions and didn't want to risk coming in. So how we're able to effectively treat patients in the future, especially given all of the unknowns that this virus is still producing, is going to be an interesting point that we're going to have to continue to follow. But I do think everyone in healthcare will have to change their model to some degree, either because of patient preferences or because of the demands that the virus will put upon us.
That's very, very interesting. Yes, Susan?
I would just add, agreeing with what Anthony said, just a spotlight on information. So we've all had electronic medical records for years. They're all different records. They don't recognize each other. We don't have one database on one patient that's universally something that somebody can be in a position to bring all these pieces of information together and analyze. And I think that had we had it and we had the chance to get it, would make a difference in terms of how we're actually able to look at different patients' height, size, weight, age, ethnicity, how they were treated, and come to conclusions around care that could be helpful, that will just take us a long time to get to. So just this whole spotlight on data. You mentioned earlier how we even kept track of the transfers. That was a manual input every single day that somebody was looking at. But in this day and age, that data, for whatever reason in healthcare, we're just behind, I think, other industries. And we could have benefited a lot more if we had ourselves to get our act together in a different way.
So let me maybe direct this a little more to Jeffrey. Another question is about, Do you think supply chain management in the entire healthcare industry, including in the area of drugs and pharmaceuticals, is likely to be reconfigured because of this fear of globalization of what has happened with the pandemic? Yeah.
Oh, I think definitely we'll see a change. You know, when I kind of got into pharmaceuticals, there's a lot of movement down for production of the drug API and fill finish in Puerto Rico. And again, all of this was, you know, that was a tax incentive in the US. And you had a lot in the US and a lot in the UK and what have you. Over the following decades, you saw that move first to places like Ireland and Singapore, and then off to India and China. I think a number of things have come out that the ability to adjust the supply chain and reconfigure it, you're going to see redundancy having to be built into it. There was a huge business of how to deal with all these old plants in the US, and now they're taking them out of mothballs, trying to figure out how to get them back up and running. I think that'll forever change. And I also think there's, you know, one of the things that Operation Warp Speed and or Warp Drive and what the Gates Foundation is focused in on, not just the drugs, but, you know, Corning is having to go very fast to just make the glass vials to put vaccines in. The way the infrastructure was configured to really make it as cost effective as possible actually impacted its flexibility and the agility. And I think you're going to see that forever change, and that will have an impact on costs, and it will have an impact on how we move forward. But yeah, it's never going to go back the way it was for drug supply.
So I'm going to take two last questions, and we have already overshot and gone beyond our time limit, but I'm going to take two more questions. One question is about this whole thing we talked about, Anthony, about insurance and payments. Do you think that this experience has changed the relationship between provider and payer, both in the government arena as well as in the arena of commercial insurance?
I think it has. I think there's even a bigger question, but, you know, specifically to your question, I think CMS clearly has tried to step up. I think they recognized what I had discussed, that, you know, the hospitals, even though they had to stop elective surgeries as well, and, you know, that was very costly for them, they had a lot of COVID volume. We had to stop elective surgeries. We had no COVID volume. We were in effect shut down. To be honest, I mean, I don't know what was worse, losing tens of millions of dollars a month or having no revenue come in. You know, it's all relative, I guess. But I think CMS did step up. They advanced payments. They tried to keep the system going. And I think that was very helpful. I think when I look at the payer side of it, you know, on the four major payers, United clearly has stepped up. They started to reimburse within 2 days of submitting claims. So they tried to take some of the premium overflow that they had and really put that back into the system. Some of the other payers that I've spoken to were struggling. They wanted to hold on to the premium payments. They didn't know how to process payments quickly. So, you know, again, it depends, I guess, on the sophistication of the payer. The bigger problem that I see happening is the fallout of the economics that we are seeing and will continue to see as more and more individuals lose their jobs and are not going to have perhaps the same amount of employer-sponsored premium, you know, healthcare plans that they once had. They will have to move to either, you know, some type of exchange product, Medicaid product. You know, that's going to change the whole dynamic and the whole landscape as well. So some of these publicly traded payers, you know, we're going to have to see what that impact of lack of premium is on their end, as well as for, you know, both hospitals and outpatient facilities like ours. You know, what's that going to mean for patients? Are they going to avoid care because their deductibles or copays now are so high that they rather just avoid it until, you know, something that maybe they would come to the hospital for their annual physical, they're not going to anymore. So again, a lot more questions than answers, but that's what the future is going to be.
So let me maybe end with an issue that I think Susan brought up right up front in the very first beginning of our discussion. And thank you folks so much for such a wonderful discussion and such a rich variety of experiences. But Susan, you brought up the whole question of ethics, that there were all these ethical questions. So I'm going to kind of get back to you and maybe end with this. We are a Jesuit university. You know, the ethics issue is always forefront for us. How do you decide who gets a ventilator? Coming down to even now, maybe something Anthony's dealing with, how do you decide who gets telemedicine and telehealth rights as opposed to others? And moving forward into the whole notion of universal healthcare, Medicare for all. Would any of that have made a difference? So to start with the ethical issue on how do you decide on who gets to live, going down to would universal healthcare have helped?
So I think we were lucky that for the most part, we didn't get to have to answer those questions. And whether it was hospital beds, ICU beds, or ventilators, we got right close to the line. However, there were a lot of conversations about, are we going to need to do this? Are we going to need to put protocols in place? How do we make those decisions? How do we understand very early on the clinical disease enough to be able to provide input to us on whether, you know, those protocols would make sense, because we weren't on solid ground there. So I would say we were very lucky that, again, we didn't have to make those decisions, but there was a lot of conversation about that. And in terms of universal health care, I think everyone that needed care got care. And that's the idea of universal health care, that nobody, you know, is not coming to the hospital. And in this case, the care was urgently needed. And so people were coming into the emergency room, or maybe they weren't. You know, if they were still afraid to come in because they were undocumented, or, you know, they were afraid of the unknowns. Did they wait too long? That's a possibility. And did they come in too late? And could they have been saved if they came in earlier, that they felt that that wasn't an issue? So as we talk it through, potentially.
Anybody else wants to take this up on the ethical questions and the question of universal care?
Well, luckily, we didn't ever have to make that decision. So I would not say that, you know, I would be an expert on that area. I would hope, though, that, you know, you would look at every, you know, possibility to try to keep every patient alive. You know, but it's a very tough decision when you look at what went on in Italy, and specifically, you know, the demand was just higher than they were able to keep up with. And, you know, you just don't want to be in that position. So the best answer is don't be in that position and do everything you can to avoid it. As far as universal health care, I mean, I think it's much more than a political conversation. I mean, I think it gets held up politically because there's strong views on both sides. But I think you have to kind of go through logistically, what does that really mean? And as you start to pull it apart and trying to connect all the dots, you realize there's a lot of unanswered questions that would have to be resolved. You know, so again, in theory, I think healthcare for all is a good concept and a much needed thing in this country. But how you go about delivering it, which is the heart and soul of the question, you know, many politicians kind of ease over that, and without answering those specific questions, it would be very hard for it to be effective. And I think if you roll anything out, you want it to be effective, or else it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
So thank you very much, tremendous panelists. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Jeff, so much for coming and helping us try to understand this complexity of what has happened and try to develop a sense of a more positive future. And thank you to all of you who are watching, and those of you who have submitted questions. I think I covered all of them, but maybe not. If I didn't, my apologies. Do write to us. We will also strongly encourage all of you to answer the few poll questions that will appear on your screen momentarily to ensure that Gabelli Forward is delivering the content and discussions that you would like to see. And for upcoming events, do go to www.fordham.edu/Gabelli Forward.